Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Kent. I'm the Director of Education for the National Atomic Testing Museum. And thank you all so much, whether you're watching virtually or here at the museum. Thank you so much for joining us today for the distinguished lecture of Todd Shrader with the Department of Energy's Office of Environmental Management. Now, on behalf of the National Atomic Testing Museum, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Todd Shrader. And I'm just going to go through a little bit of his background, and then we'll get started with the presentation. So Todd Shrader is currently serving as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Office of Environmental Management. In this role, he works to enable the safe and successful execution of EM's mission, while providing management oversight of activities, operations, and program integration across DOE sites. Mr. Shrader earned a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Florida and a master's degree in engineering from North Carolina State University. He is a registered professional engineer, and Mr. Shrader was appointed to the Senior Executive Service in November 2012. He is also a recipient of the Meritorious Service Presidential Rank Award. So once again, it's my pleasure to welcome Todd Shrader here to the National Atomic Testing Museum, and thank you so much for coming, everyone.
And thank you for the National Atomic Testing Museum for asking us to come here today and asking me to talk about the environmental management mission. Oftentimes, I think there's lots of lectures about the history of Nevada, the history of the weapons program, of the Manhattan era, et cetera. But what we don't always talk about is what happens after that. The cleanup, the effects of what happened. What are we doing to address those issues? And that's frankly within the U.S. government and the Department of Energy, specifically the mission of the Office of Environmental Management within the Department of Energy itself. Back during the Cold War, Manhattan era and Cold War, there were DOE sites in 34 states, well over 100 that we have dealt with. I'll talk a little bit more about this when we go forward here. So a mission that touches basically coast to coast across the country. To sort of define too the mission, environmental management within Department of Energy deals with the defense side of nuclear waste and nuclear cleanup. So we do not deal with civilian nuclear power plants, that type of thing. That falls under NRC regulations and for the cleanup, et cetera. So we're on the defense side of the mission or of the nuclear space within this country. So I'll go through a few slides here, talk about the program a little bit, have some pictures, obviously, of what we do, and then I'll move on to some Q&A at the end, certainly from both the in-person audience here and online. I will say sort of my own history a little bit more. Although I work in Washington, D.C. now, I did work on Yucca Mountains. I actually lived in Las Vegas for 3 years and still actually have a residence here that I come back to. So I do feel like this is always coming home when I come back to Las Vegas. And I had stops at Hanford, the WIC site in New Mexico, and assignments at headquarters through the years. Gets to now, for the last 2 years, served in headquarters of environmental management. So we'll start, where frankly all discussions about this subject start, and that's the Manhattan Project and in the 40s themselves. Obviously the project came about in World War II, or the mission space started in World War II. Many of these sites we are in at now, just some background pictures here. The big sites, LANL, Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Very key in the weapons development and putting the components together. The graphite reactor at Oak Ridge, X10, B reactor at Hanford, gas fusion plants that eventually came online at Oak Ridge, Fort Smith, Paducah. All of those, of course, led to the obligatory picture of a mushroom cloud that you have to always show, I guess, to get this kind of lecture moving forward. So it was a very expansive project back then. Obviously, a lot of secrecy around the mission. And one of the things we pride ourselves in environmental management is we are very transparent and open source program. You know, I would estimate probably 99% of what we deal with, we can talk to the public about it and clean up. And that's actually very important because in states and where you're going with the sites and clean up, it's the public who live there. We need their input in what we're doing and their decisions. As we make decisions, we need their input moving forward. And I'll talk a little bit more about community interaction later. Again, these are sort of the famous ones most people hear about, Oak Ridge and Hanford and Los Alamos, and certainly they were the very key facilities early on. But there's others that are maybe a little bit less known. You know, Paducah, Kentucky, that's a control room there. That was a gaseous diffusion plant. There were 3 gaseous diffusion plants originally that made enriched uranium or processed uranium, Oak Ridge, Portsmouth, Ohio, and Paducah, Kentucky. There were other plants spread all around the country, Idaho, Savannah River, even, you know, Pinellas, Florida had a very key plant that made components for the weapons program. Certainly all, you know, a large footprint across the country. And to kind of illustrate this and illustrate where environmental management is. So, you know, around, say, 1985 or so, these were sites all over the country that required some kind of cleanup, some kind of remediation, something to be done with it. And it varied widely. I mean, at Savannah River here in South Carolina and at Hanford up here in Eastern Washington, large underground tanks, high-level waste, vitrification projects, spent fuel, very hard, very complicated, expensive long-term projects. But many of them, particularly sort of in this area, are uranium mill tailing sites in ULTRA, Dolphin, or FuseRAP, some of the other programs associated with it, where it was a little bit more compact mission. We could get in relatively quickly and address it. Sites in Ohio oftentimes are manufacturing facilities, and so you know, it might be a case of they made a component out of uranium or beryllium or heavy metal or something. And so the cleanup was relatively straightforward. Go in, decontaminate the facility, tear it down. You know, there's no groundwater plumes, no soil contamination, that type of stuff. So originally 107 sites fell under the auspice of EM, and admittedly a few of those were even started before EM itself as a program existed. And we made lots and lots of progress early on. You know, by today, you see we're down to 16 sites around the country. So over 90 sites cleaned up, transferred to Office of Legacy Management. They're a sister organization within the Department of Energy in which they take over long-term stewardship of those sites themselves. In a few cases, the sites were cleaned up so much that they were turned back over to the community for them to reuse and truly had no presence there at all. And I'll give a couple examples of that moving forward. Our mission also, some of the remaining ones, the Livermore site up in California, Brookhaven site up in Long Island. These are actually sites that are owned by other parts of the department. Livermore, National Nuclear Security Administration, Berkeley, which is in the Bay Area, also Office of Science, Brookhaven, National Labs, and Office of Science site. So in many cases, EM will go in and have a very defined mission, tear these 3 buildings down or remediate this soil site, but we're not the site owners themselves. And you know, as we get that work done, it then allows turnover of the building and the land back to the owner for future missions that they might have. And so that's what we do in some places. Other places, we already the sole owner of the site. Portsmouth, Ohio, gaseous diffusion plant, we are the owner, so we have responsibility for the whole plant. One site I'll mention down here, WIP, Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, southeast New Mexico. That's our only non-cleanup site. That's actually a disposal facility, and we'll talk a little bit more about it. It does not have an overall cleanup mission other than supporting other sites around the country. So kind of looking at the legacy and what we've done through the years and some of the missions. One is, although the Office of Environmental Management came into existence in the late 80s, and often in this country, you know, this sort of environmental movement and environmental consciousness of environmental issues started, I guess, in the 70s and 80s. It's actually always been there for the department. You know, back in the 50s, and these are Savannah River, we were building underground storage tanks for waste back in the 40s, even in Hanford. So there was always an understanding that we do need to address these issues from an environmental perspective. But there wasn't necessarily an understanding of how to do that and matching today's regulatory environment and today's consciousness of that. Practices aren't exactly what you would see today. You know, Nevada certainly has a very defined and rigorous process for disposing of waste. Waste going back in Idaho, back in the 50s, a little bit different processes. It's now required us to go in and remediate a little bit. You know, I often get questions from people, well, what were they thinking back then? And they were thinking we have to win the Cold War. And the mission was the number one thing. And they were also thinking, we're in a desert, we're 100 miles from anyone. It's safe to dispose of waste here. Some of those practices have turned out not to be good, but it wasn't, I think, in any way people not wanting to do the right thing. I think science has just advanced and our understanding of the missions have advanced through the years. Again, we started with over 3,000 square miles that had to be cleaned up across the country. That's the size of Delaware and Rhode Island combined. We're down to about 300 miles, roughly speaking, that we're still working on. 107 sites are down to, again, 16. Over 90 million gallons of liquid waste has to still be treated. Groundwater, we've treated billions and billions of gallons of groundwater and millions of cubic meters or feet of soil. Our budget, $7.5 billion this year. It's been kind of consistently around the 7 to 7.5 range for the last few years. Congress has been very supportive of our effort. Our liability, cost to go, difficult to say, but you know, certainly in the $400, $500, $600 million range, could be as high. I'm sorry, $400, $500 billion range, could be as high depending on final treatment and everything to pushing $1 trillion. It's the number one largest environmental liability in the U.S. government and the third largest overall liability for the U.S. government behind Social Security and Medicare moving forward. Mission should clean up or should end at most of our sites relatively soon. Some of the tank waste missions, particularly Hanford, will go on for a number of decades. Just real quick, we started the Office of Environmental Management itself. Rose out of the Department of Energy. You know, I'm going to go through all these, starting, you know, the Manhattan Project in the 40s, became the Atomic Energy Commission in the 40s. In the 1970s, there was a split between the civilian side and the military side or defense side, with the Regulatory Commission assumed responsibility for the civilian side. At the time, short-lived, we were called IRDA, eventually changed to the Department of Energy in 1977, responsible for all the defense side of the house, including the cleanup. And then in 1989 itself, within the Department of Energy, Office of Environmental Management was split up and recently celebrated our 30th year anniversary a couple of years ago. Moving forward. What are our main missions today? Tank waste, 90 million gallons still at Savannah River and Hanford. This is waste that came out of the processing facility. So, you know, the fuel would get irradiated in a reactor, the uranium transmutated to plutonium. Those fuel rods and elements would then be taken to a chemical processing plant, dissolved in acid and various processes to separate out the plutonium. But there was a fair amount of waste product that came out of that in a liquid form, and it was buried, you know, or disposed of in tanks, or should be stored in underground tanks. And today we're moving to remediate those. Originally, 4 sites had this waste. One of them, West Valley. I'll show some pictures in a minute. We've completed that mission. That waste has been vitrified. It's just waiting final disposal. The other 3 sites are Idaho, Savannah River, and Hanford. If we can maintain our schedules right now, within 2 or 3 years, all the sites will be treating the waste. That'll be a really big mission accomplishment for it. We do manage some special nuclear material and spent nuclear fuel from the processing. Much of that is going into dry storage, awaiting a national repository, and wherever that might be in the future. Other solid waste, groundwater, soil, I mentioned, and D&D. We have become extremely good at tearing down buildings. 5,000 buildings at least have been torn down through years that have excess facilities moving forward. I'm sorry, go back. Just the pictures, just to give you a sense, these are, that's the WIP facility in New Mexico. This is tank farms at Hanford and some of the work they have to do to get into the underground tank. Tearing down a building at Savannah River. Note the misting. And some people say, well, why are you misting that? And the answer is there's some contamination in there, so it knocks down the contamination. It keeps it there from letting it get airborne and spreading. So it's a very common process we use to mist our facilities as we're bringing them down for contamination control purposes. And then this is inside U plant, which is one of the plants up at Hanford. You can see some of the things that are involved, or some of the construction will eventually have to remediate. Early on, 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, was frankly, we were just figuring out what to do. Drums corroded. This is spent fuel in a fuel pool, K-Basin up in Hanford. Degrading fuel. Again, I showed you Idaho, how we disposed of waste. Just various pictures figuring out what the problem was, how big it was. We didn't even understand how big underground plumes were of both radioactive waste and chemical waste, like PCE or chromium, some plumes like that. Chemicals that were used in various processes were spread throughout in some sites, fairly extensive groundwater plumes that we had to remediate. So, for most of the early, I'll call it maybe 90s through probably late 90s, much of our work was really centered more around characterization, investigation, that type thing, to really understand where we were going with the cleanup itself. One other thing that came about that time, and I mentioned this, negotiating agreements, federal, state regulators, the law changed. Up to that point, DOE had essentially been, for the most part, self-regulator in all aspects of our work. The Federal Facility Compliance Act granted to EPA and eventually to the states the ability to regulate hazardous waste. And so we have to have permits from our states that we're in to handle, treat, store, dispose of hazardous waste. Now, interesting enough, radioactive waste is not considered a hazardous waste in regulatory space. So we maintain a regulatory authority over the radioactive component. States maintain authority over the hazardous component. And so there are times it can create some tension, but fortunately we're all trying to get to the same spot and clean up, and we work through the issues with the states and getting us there. But it's changed the way we do work, and it's probably for the better because now we do have that independent oversight from the state agency as opposed to us just being self-regulating, telling everyone, don't worry about it, it's fine. That doesn't necessarily engender the greatest of trust. I think having that robust regulatory oversight from a state agency helps build trust in our cleanup and where we're going. A few examples of how we got here or what we've been doing. The Fernald site, this is used to be an old uranium processing plant. Worked to get the uranium prepped and ready to be sent to the gaseous diffusion plants for processing. Few sort of legends around them. I don't know if they're true or not, but it goes to the secret. You notice here, this checkerboard water tower there. The name of the plant was the Fernald feed plant. Rumor has it, they painted a checkerboard so people went by and said, oh, feed plant, that's like, dog food or agriculture food or something. Nothing to worry about. Keep on driving. Nothing to see here. But indeed, they were actually part of the nuclear weapons enterprise and the Cold War mission moving forward. And you can see some of the stats there. It's a 1,000-acre site. We had to tear down over 300 buildings, excavate a lot of soil, and remediate some groundwater. Today, it is a wetlands, largest man-made wetlands in the state of Ohio. It's open to the public. You can go hiking out there. You can walk around. It's real nice visitor center there. It's managed by Office of Legacy Management. This was also a site that brought up what can be a very contentious issue when you clean up sites themselves. Right here on the site is an on-site disposal cell for the radioactive hazardous waste. As we clean up sites, not unusual, we get into a debate. Should all the waste be shipped off-site? Should all the waste be disposed on-site, or where should it go? As you can imagine, there are views across the board on this, and some will say, well, if you leave it here, then the value of the land is less. Maybe not, I don't know. But obviously, if you're in a state that receives radioactive waste or hazardous waste, you might have a different opinion of how much should be coming to your state. It's issues we have to work on everywhere. Generally speaking, a sort of high-level thumb rule is when we tear down these kind of facilities, about 90% of the waste stays actually on site for disposal. And it's not necessarily all waste. A lot of it is just, frankly, a building we tore down. It's way too expensive to try to survey and figure out what was waste and not. We just call it all waste and just dispose of it all there. Very, very low levels, in some cases, no waste associated with it. But about 90% does stay on site. But as you can imagine, it's often an area of discussion with our regulators. Bernard was finished, I believe, in 2006. Rocky Flats, it's outside of Denver, between Denver and Boulder on the Front Range. Used to be a key part of the weapons program, pit manufacturing, pit production mission. In fact, the plutonium from the Hanford reactors used to go down to Rocky Flats for further processing. It was cleaned up in the late 2000s, 2006, 2008, I believe. It's now also a National Wildlife Refuge today. We certainly learned about closure contracts there and technical innovations. One of the reasons you make it a National Wildlife Refuge is you talk about end states and how clean is clean. Interesting enough, a National Wildlife Refuge in some ways doesn't need to be cleaned up quite as much as, say, a site release for residential use in the future or things like that. And those decisions are made with the local community, with the state, and everyone else working together. What do you want the final site to look like when you're done? This site was also infamous. It was raided by the FBI for environmental noncompliance back in the late 90s, I think it was. Interesting, we are actually overseen by other parts of the government. In the end, the issues were resolved and things got moving. Also being our first big site, the original estimates were this will take 30 years and $30 billion. We got it done in 6 years and $6 billion, figuring out ways to do things smarter moving forward. And then one more site I'll mention is the Mound site. This is just south of Dayton in Ohio. Also, they manufactured different components for various weapon systems moving forward. Operated from 1948 to 2003. This is interesting because we finished the cleanup, but it didn't become a National Wildlife Refuge. The town wanted it for redevelopment, so it became a business park within the town, and they have since managed to get some new businesses to move in there, reindustrialize the area, develop sort of an economic engine for that part of the city moving forward. So this is what I talk about. We work very hard with communities. What do you want your site to look like at the end? And how can we get there together moving forward? There is, though, I will say, one thing to note about all three of those sites. They're done, they're cleaned up. One of the huge advantages they had was they did not have tank waste, which is potentially high-level waste when it gets, and there's no disposal for that right now. They didn't have particularly huge groundwater plumes or things like that. They had some, and Fernald did have some, but they've since been remediated for the most part. And frankly, they were near big cities. And so ending the mission didn't necessarily have a disproportionate impact on the community. Where some of our sites, and I'll talk about in a minute, they're in cities where it's the major employer around. And so ending the mission has a very, very significant impact on the community. And certainly it affects how we move forward. WIP, just to mention some of our active facilities. I mentioned this down in New Mexico. Started disposing of waste in 1999. It's a salt mine, 2,100 feet underground. Picture of it there, waste being disposed. It disposed of transuranic waste, which is waste contaminated with radionuclides that are above uranium on the periodic table. So the vast majority of which being plutonium and man-made. It requires long, deep geological repository for disposal due to their long life. Very safe mission, 13,000 shipments have been made to the facility through the year, all safely done. Sort of a one sort of, again, legend piece of this, or funny legend piece. That's Bill Richardson. He was the Secretary of Energy back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and he was the governor of New Mexico, where the site is, I think 2003 to 10, 9, 10, something like that. As I said, things can get contentious between states, and sometimes that ends in litigation. There was a lawsuit filed against the Department of Energy before he was governor. So it was, New Mexico versus Bill Richardson, Secretary of Energy. He became governor. The lawsuit kept going. There's some changes, and ironically enough, it became Richardson versus Richardson, governor or secretary, moving forward. But as a leader, you also represent your stakeholders or your groups behind it. But go ahead. Gaseous diffusion plants, part of what happens there, you produce what's called uranium tails, depleted uranium hexafluoride, or DUF6, as it's commonly called. We have many tons and containers of it at the Portsmouth and Paducah sites in Ohio and Kentucky. We built a facility, the facility is at both of them, to stabilize that for long-term storage. It's very reactive, chemically reactive, until it gets stabilized. And so in some cases, ironically enough, to clean up a site and tear it down, you actually have to build facilities first to do the treatment. Then you have to tear them down too. Sometimes it's not always easy to explain that, but we do often have to treat first and put infrastructure money in. Then we turn around and tear it down as we get it clean. Vitrification West Valley, this is outside of Buffalo, Ellicottville, New York, I think is closest city, is about an hour south of Buffalo. It was an old initial vitrification facility. This is one of the interesting sites. It's actually half owned by, or partly owned by New York State and partly owned by the Department of Energy. It does, ironically enough, make some challenges on how you dispose of the waste moving forward, but it was an old facility, mostly torn down. We're down to the final parts and pieces, the most contaminated parts of the plant. In fact, this fall, we will start tearing down that last bit of it. But it was the original plant that proved vitrification, which is essentially pouring the waste into a big steel container, adding glass formers, heating it to 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, turning it to glass. It's a very effective long-term isolation and disposal technology for long-lived radionuclides. Some cases, there's our sites have been turned into national historic parks, part of very key part of the country's history. And much like this facility here documents where we went, how we got here and some effective history. The national historic parks, B reactor at Hanford, Los Alamos, and K-25 at Oak Ridge were key. And so they've turned them into museums. If you're ever in the Tri-Cities and get a chance to take the tour, Tri-Cities, Washington, take the tour of B reactor, it's pretty interesting. You can actually go in and see that literally this was the place people like Enrico Fermi, developed the technologies of reactor nucleonics and reactor physics. And you can literally see his office still there, preserved. And so that was the first reactor to make plutonium on a large scale for the weapons program back in the 40s. In fact, that plutonium from that reactor is what we used at Nagasaki during the war. Nevada, we're here. Just a little bit about what we do here. Obviously, a lot of the cleanup is associated with the old weapons testing days. But fortunately, this work has been very successful here. We're over, I think, 99% done with all our corrective actions. Last few to go. at various disposal sites or various waste sites that we have around the site. A couple more buildings to tear down over the next couple of years moving forward. Roughly speaking, by the end of the decade, we should be done with the environmental management mission here in Nevada. We will have it cleaned up. We're, of course, still a long-term mission for waste disposal here from around the complex, certain types of waste that have to be disposed here, and the national security mission that will continue to be ongoing up there. We also do a lot of, as we restore sites, we try to restore vegetation to it, try to get it looking like as much as it did before the disturbance of the work. So again, I'll just go ahead. Flash these. That's where we started. We're down to a handful of sites going forward. I mentioned tank waste treatment. These are the facilities we've built to treat those. Low activity waste facility at Hanford, tank farms, 177 underground tanks, 56 million gallons that will eventually have to be treated and disposed of one day in facilities like this, and a sister plant will build for it. Integrated waste treatment unit, Idaho, 700,000 gallons that have to be treated up there and disposed, solidified, or stabilized for long-term disposal. And salt waste processing facility at Savannah River, and some of their tanks that contain about 30 million gallons of waste down there moving forward. So really big and important part of what we're doing is having all the capability to treat the tank waste moving forward. Plutonium finishing plant, great success story up at Hanford. This plant probably pushing 2/3 of all the plutonium in the stockpile, in the U.S. stockpile, went through this plant through the years. Used to be highly contaminated facility. Here it is standing and operating today. Basically all torn down, moving the last piles of debris out of there. Great success story. A facility that, as it's standing, you spend millions of dollars every year in upkeep. Now that it's gone, that money is freed up for other missions down the line. Oak Ridge, again, I mentioned the gaseous diffusion plants there. These buildings used to be here one time. Some of these buildings are largest on the roof, and there might be 14, 15 acre buildings. I mean, mammoth buildings, all torn down, being restored. Parts of the land turned over to the city. Parts have been set aside for conservation areas, community reuse. Also at Oak Ridge, just a good example, is the biology complex, often called in the past, parts of it the mouse house, because they used to do biological experiments, affects radiation through the years. It's being torn down at Oak Ridge, and that land turned back over to the National Nuclear Security Administration for future stockpile stewardship missions and things like that. So that's an example of, here we turned it over to the town, here we turn it back over to a sister organization within the department for future reuse moving forward. Portsmouth, Paducah, I had mentioned these. This building, so this was probably 3 months ago. It's starting to tear down. That's my boss, Mike White. He's actually the head of the environmental management program. One of the things we have to do, to get to this point of tearing down, it's a lot of work you got to do. You got to ensure all the nuclear material is stabilized or removed out of there. You flush the systems, you get all the loose material out. You put sealant. You try to make the building as safe as possible. You remove all the utilities, make it safe. You don't want to cut into live wires. So, a plant will go from looking like this to cleaned out before we start tearing it down, and then eventually you get into, tearing it down with big pieces of equipment. A few small sites around the country. West Valley, we talked about. Brookhaven, up in New York, we just took this stack down literally this winter. This was earlier this year. And E-Tech, which is in Southern California, in Ventura County, we've been tearing down some old buildings that were there. This was earlier this year, and then within the last few months, you can see the buildings have been torn down and removed. Waste isolation pilot plant, another one where we're investing in the future. It's going to operate for at least 30 more years. So we're doing some capital upgrades and adding some ventilation equipment And again, I mentioned this about turning sites over. Phenol's another picture of it. This is Spruce site up in New York. It's a naval reactor site. This used to have a big contaminated building on it. Now it's Greenfield. Here in Nevada, we finished all our work up in Tonopah, the test range. Turned that land back over for use by the Air Force or long-term stewardship for legacy management. And we're now down all of our work down here in the main site itself. We issue every year for the last couple of years and hopefully continue a 10-year look ahead. That's the website there. It just talks about the sites moving forward or the program moving forward and where we might go with it and what we're thinking moving forward. We also issue every year a priority list to lay out, what we're going to get done that year. We try to make it aggressive. Last couple of years, we haven't quite gotten everything. That's okay. Things happen. COVID obviously impacted us the last couple of years and some of the work we have done. But we try to be aggressive in setting our priorities and moving forward. We probably run 80%, 90% of them get complete moving forward. So, we started here years ago, 30 years ago. Go ahead. This is where we were today or more. So 10 years from now, 2031, where we're going to be. Probably 4 or 5 of those sites done again, back down to, hopefully with any luck, 10 sites around the country left. 10 years after that, down to 2 or 3. By 2050, probably down to 1. Hanford is going to take a little bit of time. I had mentioned stakeholder interface and what we do with the community. Very important. This is a picture of a Nevada employee, Tiffany. Thank you. She just held a virtual site tour for high school students here in Clark County for STEM students. So we try to work hard with the local community, talk about what we do, frankly, looking at the future and our future workforce and how we can get people interested in it. Future probably involves robots more and more. The technology is advanced. With the Hanford, some of the robots will send into tanks because it's too dangerous to send people in. National Lab at Savannah River, moving forward. And this is a good example here of working with the tribal nations in Nevada and revegetation. How can we return the site to what it used to look like and who are the experts of what it used to look like, and the tribal nations often are. So we have good relationships around the country with most of the tribes, and we work with them very, very closely in moving the sites forward. And then this is the last slide, and I'll take some questions after this. Obviously, January, a new administration came on. Where are they on what we've been doing? Very much Secretary, very supportive of the mission. She said so in her confirmation hearings, absolutely dedicated, ensuring that, we're committed to continuing to clean up. One of the things we talked about in a point of emphasis is environmental justice and moving forward, who is benefiting from the cleanup. It is our local communities, particularly communities that are disadvantaged communities near our sites benefiting from the cleanup and our business being benefiting, local businesses, small businesses. We require all our contractors to have small business set-asides to work with disadvantaged businesses, small businesses, Native American businesses, that type of thing, to try to grow the overall industrial base and to address economic justice issues moving forward. Again, building the long-term workforce. I mentioned we're about 32 years old now. Almost no one is still around who was around when we started again. We're about to literally turn over the next generation. And so bringing those in, looking at the future, what skills do we need? Getting into the colleges now, today, to build the workforce of the future, and one that reflects the country as a whole, to get different perspectives that are key when you're talking about what the site should look like at the end. And then climate change and sustainability. If you're siting a disposal cell and you make an assumption of how much it'll rain, and it rains more or rains less, or wildfires become more common, how are you taking that into account as we're looking at these long-term missions and long-term stewardship missions at the sites? And so we're working hard with climate change and sustainability, and there's some actions within the department to develop plans moving forward. So I think the EM is very aligned with that. I think our mission through the years has been very much aligned with these, but even more so, there's areas of emphasis within the administration that we're working hard to make sure we implement the president and the secretary's these initiatives that they have developed moving forward, administration priorities moving forward. So it kind of gives you just I think a touch of what we do. Again, I'll make the case again. Very important, the front end mission, but the back end mission is very important too. Not only is it morally right and the right thing to do to clean up these sites, but even looking forward, if we want future missions, people who live around these sites got to know we are going to clean them up if we're done. We're not just going to walk away from it. It's the way you build support going forward. So I think it's a very important mission overall. I very much enjoy what I do. I think there's a great sense of pride within our workforce. There's about 35,000 people across the country who work for EM, and really enjoy it. So with that, I'll take some questions. Sure. Tank waste, for the most part, besides some parts and pieces, for the most part, it's going to be high-level waste, which under the law has to go to a national repository for disposal. And it tends to meet the waste acceptance process, it has to be vitrified. And so you have to build these big, huge vitrification facilities to pump the waste in, mix it with this glass, that type of thing. Also, particularly in the case of Hanford, some of this waste has been sitting in tanks for 70 years. It's not just nice liquid waste. It's a sludge. It's like peanut butter in some cases. Pumping peanut butter is not the easiest thing to do in the world. And in other cases, it forms what's called salt cake. My shower head here gets that little calcium buildup. We can imagine that on a large scale in a tank, and it becomes rock hard concrete. Well, how do you get that out of a tank? There's robotic means. You can't put people in there. Oftentimes, it's highly radioactive. It's nasty chemicals, carcinogenic chemicals. In some cases, many cases at Hanford, a number of those tanks have leaked through the years. And so, one of the ways we retrieve waste is you kind of go in and spray it down with a liquid to kind of dissolve that salt case and kind of get it mobilized, right? So you can pump it out. Well, how do you do that with a tank that, frankly, the bottom is ripped open because of processes in the past? You don't want to introduce more liquid to it because then it leaks out. In some cases, if you're spraying, you might shoot right through the wall of a corroded tank, things like that. So it's just really, really tough to deal with moving forward.
I know we're going to be potentially, continuing to develop up in our group. So we're going to do about 2% for maybe in production now around the United States. Or are you guys involved in plants that are actually producing these type of, cleanup and maintaining those?
Sure. I had mentioned the end of our mission at our various sites. And I'll caveat that a little bit. That's the legacy mission, buildings that exist now. But you're correct. Eventually, we are going to probably take other buildings that are currently production facilities, and we will have to tear those down. So, not sure now. The other thing we try to do nowadays too is build with decommissioning in mind. And so, you might have a process cell that you just have concrete there. Well, if you had a leak in there, it gets in the concrete, it gets through the concrete, it's a mess. Now we line all process cells with stainless steel, like almost a bathtub underneath it to catch the waste. So we're trying to get smarter in building with decommissioning in mind moving forward. But yes, in theory, your guess is good as mine how long the weapons program goes or whatever, but in theory, almost all those facilities will one day have to be disposed, and an organization, if not environmental management, similar to environmental management, will have to address those issues one day.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, we'll go to the Zoom and see if there's any questions there. Okay. Doesn't look like we have any more questions, so there we go. Thank you so much, Todd, for coming and speaking with us today here at the museum. Like I said, talking about the wonderful work being done by EM. And thank you everybody for watching from Zoom and watching here at the museum. Thank you so much for being here. And I would like to talk to you about the next distinguished lecture that we're going to have here at the museum. It's going to be on August 12th, and it's our second annual partnership with the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum in Hiroshima, Japan. The speaker is a atomic bomb survivor from the August 6, 1945 bombing of Hiroshima, Japan. So they will be speaking through an interpreter through Zoom, but we're also going to be having seats here if you want to come and check that out. Last year was amazing, and this one is shaping up to be even better. So we are really looking forward to that. So come check us out. But like I said, it's going to be free. It's going to be on Zoom, or it's going to be here in person, whichever you prefer. So thank you all so much again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your Saturday and weekend, and we look forward to having you back here at the National Atomic Testing Museum.